Delphine had been standing in the hallway outside her husband's study for 11 seconds before she understood what she was hearing. She had not intended to eavesdrop. She had come down from the upper floor to retrieve the ledger she had left on the side table near the study door. The one with the October wool shipment figures, which she needed before the Whitmore accounts dinner at 8 o'clock that evening. She had walked down the hall in her good silk dress, the deep green one Corwin had commented on precisely once in 3 years of marriage, and she had reached for the door handle and stopped. It was Neve's voice that stopped her, not Corwin's. She had heard Corwin in conversation 100 times through that door. Business matters, correspondence dictated to his secretary, the occasional telephone call that echoed through the old house in ways he had not yet adjusted to. She knew the cadence of his voice when he was working, clipped and unhurried. Neither warm nor cold, simply efficient. She had made a study of Corwin Harwick's efficiency in 3 years. It was the primary quality she had learned to navigate. But Neve's voice in that room, at 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours before the dinner, that was not something Delphine had accounted for. She stood with her hand, not quite touching the door handle, and listened. "The physician's letter," Corwin was saying. "Wainwright says we need it before the 15th. Dr. Renfield will sign it." Neve's voice was lower than usual, careful in the way of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and is performing it now without the rehearsal showing. "He signed one for Alderman Haynes's wife last spring. He understands what is required." A pause. "Delphine will contest it." "Not if the letter is specific enough." Nervous collapse. Corwin, brought on by the strain of managing her father's estate alone before the marriage, and compounded by the responsibilities she insists on maintaining at the mill. "It's entirely plausible." Another pause, and when Neve spoke again, something in her voice had shifted toward something more intimate, more deliberate. "Once the mill management transfers to you legally, she has no standing to challenge the operational decisions. The conservatorship covers it." Wainwright confirmed this. Delphine's hand fell away from the door handle. She pressed her back against the wallpaper and looked at the ceiling. Conservatorship. The word settled in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, not breaking the surface, just sinking, slow and cold, to the bottom. She had managed the Blackwood woolen mill in Hartford, Connecticut, for 2 full years after her father's death, and before her marriage to Corwin Harwick, who had arrived at the mill's offices on a February afternoon with excellent references, a calm manner, and a proposal that her father's former business partner had described as fortuitous. She had managed it through a winter flood that took out the lower dye house, through a dispute with the Transport Guild, through 2 bad seasons for New England wool, when the Western suppliers undercut every price her buyers had expected. She had kept 43 people employed. She had kept every contract her father had signed. She had increased Eastern distribution by 12% in the first year. She had done all of this while being married to a man who had described their union, on the evening after the ceremony, as a sensible arrangement for both parties. Delphine stood in the hallway of the house Corwin Harwick owned on Prospect Street, and she did not cry and she did not make a sound. She stood very still, and she let herself understand, completely and without interruption, exactly what was happening. Then she went back upstairs. Her father had kept his private correspondence in a locked box in the mill office, not in the house. She had always known this. What she had not known, until the morning after his funeral, when Oswald had handed her a small envelope with her name in her father's handwriting, was that a duplicate set of the mill's founding documents, the original deed of ownership from 1851, the trust instrument establishing the Blackwood family's sole claim to the property, and 2 letters from the family attorney, describing the precise legal conditions under which that ownership could be transferred or challenged, was kept in a different location entirely. Delphine had read those documents once, the morning Oswald had given them to her, and then placed them in the care of Thaddeus Wainwright, the Blackwood family's attorney of record for 30 years. Because she had trusted him, and because her father had trusted him, and because she had been 26 years old, and in the first week of her grief. She had not thought about them since. Until now. She changed out of the green silk and into the gray wool she wore when she went to the mill. Not because she was going to the mill, but because it had pockets, and because it was the kind of dress she could move in without thinking about the dress. She sat at the writing desk in her bedroom and wrote 2 notes. The first was to Wainwright's office on Asylum Street, 4 blocks away. The second was to a woman named Odette Larkin on Farmington Avenue, whom Delphine had met once, at a charitable society meeting in September, and who had told her something in passing that Delphine had filed away as sad and not particularly relevant. Odette had been married before, briefly, in Albany, to a man who had petitioned successfully to have her declared mentally unfit to manage a small hotel her first husband had left her. She had fought for 2 years and lost. The man who had petitioned was named Ridley Byrne. Ridley Byrne was Corwin's business partner. Delphine sealed both notes and called for Oswald. Oswald Greaves had worked for the Blackwood family for 28 years. He was 61 years old and had the bearing of a man who had organized the logistics of a complicated household for so long that efficiency had become indistinguishable from his personality. He had served Delphine's father through the mill's early difficulties, through her mother's long illness, through her mother's death. He had stood at the back of the church at Delphine's wedding, with his hands folded and his face showing nothing, which was the face he wore when he was holding something he had not been asked to hold. He came into the bedroom when she called, took one look at her face, and said, "What do you need, Miss Blackwood?" He had called her Miss Blackwood since the wedding, not Mrs. Harwick. She had noticed and had not corrected it, because she had understood it as the quiet fidelity it was. "I need you to deliver these," she said, and handed him the notes. "The first one immediately, in person, don't leave it with a clerk. The second one on your way back, and wait for an answer." He looked at the addresses. His expression did not change, but something sharpened behind his eyes. "And the dinner this evening?" "I'll attend the dinner. That's not in question." "Very good." He paused at the door. "Is there anything else I should know, Miss Blackwood?" She looked at him. "Not yet. There may be later." He nodded the way her father had always nodded when he understood something that didn't need to be said out loud, and went. Thaddeus Wainwright arrived at the Prospect Street house at 6:30. He was 70 years old, deliberate in his movements, and had the particular quality of stillness that very good lawyers develop over long careers. The stillness of a man who has heard a great many things in confidence and learned not to react to any of them until he has finished thinking. He sat across from Delphine in the front parlor, with the Blackwood Trust documents open between them, and listened to what she had heard outside the study door without interrupting once. When she finished, he was quiet for a full minute. "Ridley Byrne," he said. "I didn't know the connection until today," Delphine said. "Odette Larkin has agreed to come tomorrow morning with her Albany court documents. But I needed to ask you first whether you had heard anything." Wainwright looked at the wall above her head, which was what he did when he was sorting through information. "Corwin came to my office in August," he said slowly. "He asked questions about the trust instrument. He framed them as general inquiries, wanting to understand your father's estate. I answered what I thought were reasonable questions for a husband to ask." A pause. "I may have explained how property management can be legally transferred under certain circumstances." "Did you tell him about the conservatorship provision?" "I told him it existed." He met her eyes. "I did not tell him I believe those circumstances applied to you. I want you to understand that." "I do," Delphine said, and she did. But someone told him enough to know it was possible. "Ridley Byrne has used this method before," Wainwright said, his voice taking on the flat, careful quality of a man laying something unpleasant on a table where it needed to be. "I didn't know about Albany when Corwin and Byrne's partnership was formed." Delphine folded her hands on the documents. "What can we accomplish before 8 o'clock?" Wainwright looked at her steadily. "Not everything, but enough." The Whitmore Accounts dinner was held at the Hartford Club on Prospect Street, 6 doors from the house. It was a monthly gathering of the 14 men who controlled most of Hartford's commercial lending, 3 of their wives, and this month, at Corwin's invitation, Delphine, who attended such dinners perhaps twice a year, and who was described on such occasions as a pleasant addition to the table, which was a way of saying she was not expected to talk about the mill. She had worn the green silk dress after all. She had thought about it for exactly 1 minute, and decided that it was the right choice, because Corwin had noticed it once, and she wanted him, when he looked at her this evening, to see something familiar, something he thought he understood. Ridley Byrne was at the dinner. She had not expected that, though perhaps she should have. He was a large man, pleasant-faced, the kind of man whose laugh made other people feel included in something. She had met him 4 times and found him unremarkable each time, which she now reconsidered. Corwin was seated to her left. He spoke to the man on his right about a railroad bond. He passed her the bread basket and refilled her water glass, and in every particular behaved as a man who expected the evening to proceed exactly as planned. Delphine ate her soup and watched Ridley Byrne across the table and thought about Odette Larkin, who would arrive at 9 in the morning, and about Wainwright, who had spent the hours between 6:30 and dinner in the Blackwood Mill office across the city, reviewing documents by lamplight. The dessert course had just been removed when Byrne said, pleasantly, to no one in particular, "Corwin, I believe you had something to present to the table this evening." Corwin reached into his coat and removed a folded document. He unfolded it and placed it on the table in front of Delphine without looking at her. The mill's Eastern distribution contract. It requires your signature for the quarterly renewal. Wainwright asked me to have it completed before the 15th. Delphine looked at the document. She did not pick it up. It was not a distribution contract. The language at the top of the first paragraph was not the language of a distribution renewal. It was the language of a management transfer, of a conservatorship application. The names on the document were Corwin Harwick and Ridley Byrne Associates. The signature line at the bottom had her name typed beneath it. She looked up. Corwin was watching her with the composed expression of a man who expected her to do what he had been told was a routine thing. Ridley Byrne, across the table, had his wineglass raised and was not looking at her at all, which told her he was very carefully not looking at her. "Thaddeus," Delphine said. The dining room door opened. Wainwright came in, along with a second man, the alderman he had reached at 7 o'clock that evening, who had personal reason to know Byrne's business methods and who had agreed, without hesitation, to be present. The table went quiet. "This document," Delphine said, clearly enough that all 14 men of the Hartford Lending Club and their 3 wives heard every word, "is not a distribution contract. It is a conservatorship application asserting that I am mentally unfit to manage the Blackwood woolen mill, signed in advance by a Hartford physician who was paid for his signature. It was placed in front of me this evening by my husband, in a social setting, in the expectation that I would not read it carefully before signing." She looked at Corwin. He was very still. The composure had not broken, she would always acknowledge that, but it had become something different. The composure of a man who is calculating very fast whether there is still a move available to him. "This document," Wainwright said from the doorway, in the dry, precise voice of a man who had practiced law for 45 years, "also contains 2 forged attestations. I have the originals in my possession. The signatures do not match." He paused. "Mr. Byrne, I believe you are familiar with the conservatorship proceeding against Mrs. Odette Larkin in Albany County in 1876. The method here is substantially similar." Ridley Byrne set down his wineglass. The sound it made on the table was the only sound in the room. Delphine folded the document that had been placed in front of her and placed it in her evening bag. She looked at the 14 men of the Hartford Lending Club, her father's colleagues, some of them, and her husband's, who would leave this evening having seen something they would not forget. "My father built the Blackwood Mill in 1851, she said. "He ran it for 22 years. I have run it for 5, including the 2 before this marriage and the 3 within it. The mill has 43 employees. Every contract my father signed has been honored." She looked at Corwin once more. "I did not sign this document. I will not sign this document. And I am asking every person in this room to understand what was almost done here tonight and to act accordingly." Corwin said quietly, "Delphine." She looked at him. For a moment, only a moment, she allowed herself to look at him the way she had once or twice in 3 years allowed herself to look, searching for the thing she had not been certain was there. Whether there was something in Corwin Harwick that was more than the sensible arrangement he had described on the evening after their wedding. What she found now was a man who had known what was in that document, and had placed it in front of her anyway. She looked away. What happened in the hours that followed was not dramatic. Wainwright filed the formal complaint against Ridley Byrne with the Hartford County Clerk before midnight. Corwin left the club and did not return to the Prospect Street house. Delphine went home in the carriage, alone, and sat at the writing desk in her bedroom and wrote 3 letters. One to Odette Larkin, explaining what had happened and confirming she would be needed. One to the mill foreman, asking him to change the locks on the management office the following morning. The third she held in her hands for a long time before she began it. She wrote it twice. The first draft she crossed out, the second she kept. "What you did this evening," she wrote, "you understood was wrong. Not because you are a foolish man. You are not, but because you did it anyway, and a man who knows a thing is wrong, and does it regardless understands it more clearly than one who simply doesn't know. I don't know how much of what I heard today was your plan, and how much was Byrne's. I intend to find out. But I want you to understand something before anything else is decided. The mill is not stubbornness. It is not a trophy. It is the work of my father's life, and the work I was trained to do by the person who understood me best. I will not surrender it. Not to you, not to Byrne, not to any physician whose name I do not recognize. You told me on the evening of our wedding that our marriage was a sensible arrangement for both parties. I accepted that. I honored it. What you placed in front of me tonight was not a sensible arrangement. It was a theft. When you are ready to be honest about how this came to happen, I will listen, not before. She sealed it and left it with Oswald to deliver in the morning. Corwin read the letter at 9 the next morning in the rooms he had taken at the Allen house on Trumbull Street. He read it twice, which was not something he did with most correspondents. He sat in the chair by the window with the letter on his knee and looked at the street below. He had married Delphine Blackwood because the arrangement was sound, and because Ridley Byrne had suggested, in that offhand way of his that turned out never to be offhand, that a man with Corwin's ambitions and a woman with Delphine's assets were a natural fit. He had gone into it clear-eyed. He had believed. He had gone into it knowing exactly what it was. What he had not accounted for, and he sat with this now, the November light coming gray through the window, was the woman herself. He had not accounted for the way Delphine managed a room, the way she managed a ledger. Without waste, without performance, attending to the thing that needed attending to. He had not accounted for the quality of her attention, which was unlike any attention he had received before, because it was not admiration and not deference and not calculation. It was simply the attention of a person who was paying attention, and it had done something to him over 3 years that he had not allowed himself to name. He had placed that document in front of her. He had known what it was. He had told himself it was business. He read the letter a third time. What you placed in front of me tonight was not a sensible arrangement. It was a theft. He folded it, put it in his coat pocket, and went to find Thaddeus Wainwright. What Corwin told Wainwright took 2 hours to say. Ridley Byrne had approached him in March, not with the conservatorship scheme directly, but in increments, each one presented as a reasonable next step from the one before. First, the idea that Delphine was overtaxing herself and would benefit from Corwin assuming formal oversight. Then the suggestion that formal oversight would require legal documentation. Then the physician. Then the document. Then the dinner at the Hartford Club. Corwin had known at each step that it was further than the step before. He had told himself he was managing the situation. You were not managing the situation, Wainwright said. You were participating in it. Corwin was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said, I was. Odette Larkin arrived at the Prospect Street house at 9 that morning with a leather portfolio of Albany court documents. She was 34 years old, with the careful composure of a woman who had spent years reconstructing something that had been taken from her. She laid the documents on the parlor table without preamble. He used the same physician, she said. Different letterhead, same handwriting. I kept everything. Would you be willing to give a sworn statement? Delphine asked. I have been willing for 3 years, Odette said. I simply didn't have anywhere to give it that would matter. Neve Colston came to the house on Wednesday morning. Delphine had expected her eventually. When Neve sat down in the parlor, with her hands folded and said she was sorry, Delphine let her finish before she spoke. How long had you known Ridley Byrne? Delphine asked. Neve looked at her hands. 2 years. He was introduced through a mutual acquaintance. He told me the mill was making Corwin unhappy, that you were making Corwin unhappy, because you refused to share the management. She stopped. He said all he wanted was for Corwin to be able to do his work properly. And you believed him. I wanted to believe him. Neve's voice had dropped. I wanted there to be a reason that Corwin married you and not. She stopped again, pressed her lips together. I knew something was wrong when I saw the physician's letter. I said nothing. Delphine sat across from her oldest friend and felt the particular weight of 20 years of knowing a person settle on her shoulders. I am not going to pretend this did not happen, she said. You were in that room. Whatever Byrne told you, you chose to be there, and the choice matters regardless of the reason. She held Neve's gaze. But I also know that you were in that room because Byrne put you there specifically. He chose you because you were close to me. That is how men like him work. They find the nearest person you trust and they use her. Neve looked up. Her eyes were wet. Tell Wainwright everything Byrne told you, Delphine said. Every conversation, every name, every plan he described. A pause. Leave nothing out because you think it reflects badly on you. I already know it does. What I need now is the truth. The legal proceedings took 4 months. Ridley Byrne contested every charge with the resources and representation of a man who had prepared for the possibility of being caught. His preparation had not accounted for Odette Larkin, for Neve Colston's testimony, or for a full written account from Corwin Harwick, offered voluntarily, without negotiation, which Wainwright noted in his filing because it always mattered to courts when a man chose honesty over strategy. During his review of Byrne's business records, Wainwright discovered that the Albany matter had not been Byrne's first scheme but his third. There were 2 other women, in 2 other cities, whose property had passed out of their names through the same combination of medical letters, and social pressure and legal manipulation. Wainwright wrote to both women. One did not respond. The other did, within a week, with a letter careful and precise and 4 pages long, describing what had happened to her with the clarity of someone who has spent years waiting to be believed. Delphine kept that letter in the Blackwood mill office, in a locked box with a key on her watch chain, the box that had been her father's. Ridley Byrne was convicted of fraud and conspiracy in the spring. Corwin did not contest the petition for separation of the marital property. He signed the documentation returning the mill to Delphine's sole legal management within 3 weeks of the formal complaint being filed, handing the papers to Wainwright with the expression of a man who has understood something too late and is doing the only decent thing still available. He sent her one letter afterward. It was short. I knew what was in that document, it said. You were right to call it what it was. I am sorry for the 3 years before it as much as for that evening, for the sensible arrangement, and for treating your life and your work as a variable in someone else's equation. You were not a variable. You never were. I was too careful about the wrong things to see it. I hope the mill prospers. I expect it will. She read it once, sitting at her desk with the November accounts in front of her, then folded it and placed it in the box with the other correspondence from those months, and locked it, and put the key back on her chain. She thought about what he had said, about treating her life as a variable. She thought it was probably the most honest thing he had ever said to her, and she thought it was a shame it had taken this long. Then she turned back to the accounts. The mill did prosper. The Eastern distribution contract that had been used as a prop at the Hartford Club dinner turned out to be a real contract, negotiated in good faith by one of the club members, who had watched what happened that evening, and had decided he preferred doing business with someone who read documents before signing them. Oswald remained. He had served the Blackwood family through 1 death and 1 near catastrophe, and he had no intention of ceasing. He brought the morning correspondence at 8 o'clock every workday, and he never placed anything on Delphine's desk without first having determined whether it required immediate attention or could wait. She told him once, in the spring, that he had done more than she had known how to ask for. He said, in the manner of a man who has kept a family's business private for 28 years, and intends to keep doing so, that it had been no more than any situation required. She let that stand. It was the truest version of what he meant. In June, Odette came to Hartford for the final hearing in the Byrne proceedings, and stayed 3 days in the East guest room. In the evenings after dinner, they sat in the front parlor and talked. Not always about the case. Sometimes about the hotel Odette had eventually recovered through a separate civil action, about what it had taken to rebuild something that had been deliberately destroyed, about the specific quality of patience required to do hard things over a long time, without the assurance they would come out right. On the last evening Odette said, "You should sell the house." Delphine looked at her. "The one on Prospect Street," Odette said. "It was never yours. You lived in it for 3 years, but it was never the place you belonged." She paused. "The mill office is where you belong. I've seen it. You walk differently when you come through that door." Delphine was quiet for a moment. "My father built a house on the mill property, the original building, before the Prospect Street house. I've been thinking about whether to restore it." Odette smiled. The first smile Delphine had seen from her without anything complicated behind it. "Then restore it," she said. "Stop thinking." The restoration was completed in October. It was a small house by the standards of the Prospect Street neighborhood. 4 rooms, a porch that overlooked the mill yard, a study that smelled, when the weather was right, of the wool from the dye house 3 buildings over. Delphine moved in on a Thursday, with Oswald's help and without ceremony. She put her father's desk by the window. The window faced east, toward the river, and in the mornings the light came in at a flat angle that made it easy to read figures without a lamp. She put the locked box in the lower desk drawer. The key went back on her chain. She sat at the desk on the first morning and opened the new November accounts and began to work. The mill yard was already in motion outside the window. She could hear it. The rhythm of the looms from the main floor, the voices of the loading crew, the particular sound a full morning made when 43 people were doing their work and do it well. She had heard that sound for 5 years. She thought she would hear it for many more. Her father had known her well enough to leave her the means to protect what he had built. She had known herself well enough to use them when it mattered. That, she thought, looking out at the yard where the October light was just breaking over the roofline, was what inheritance actually meant. Not the deed in the box, not the building. The knowing, and what you did with it, and whether you did it without flinching when flinching would have been so much easier. She turned back to the figures. Outside, the mill ran on.